Thanks everyone for having me. Obviously, Dr. Heenan. I am the program director for the MFT program, so I always enjoy an opportunity to come and visit with all of you and put names with faces that I've interacted with via email, since I'm not in the courses as much anymore. I will be talking about ethical challenges. I will preface this with a quick apology, though, in that I have to log off 10 minutes before 6. My son sprung an unexpected school requirement on me that starts at 6. So I have to take leave, but I think Dr. Bayman agreed to stay the full hour if there was extra lingering questions or concerns. So I just wanted to acknowledge that in advance in case I make an abrupt exit midstream on a question. In thinking about ethical challenges in site-based learning, there's many places I could go, for instance, in terms of specific issues that arise. But for the presentation I'm going to give in the discussion, I'm going to talk a little bit more generally, and then I'm going to let you guys ask more specific questions or give scenarios based upon the general statements I'm making. But I think maybe it's a bit more helpful to start at the forest level before we get into the trees, perhaps. So, and part of what I guess informs this conversation and maybe some of my experience is, one, I have served on a licensing board. I just ended a 12-year term in March. So I've been on a licensing board where we have, enforced ethics and enforced regulations and rules within the state of Wyoming for that length of time. And then within our program, I oversee any of our professional standards committee referrals. So what those referrals are is if a learner has had professional dispositional challenges, like they're not being very professional or they're not showing up to the site, or they're engaging in what might be ethical challenges as well, like not doing paperwork, not responding to the site, leaving the site, or abandoning clients, those kind of things. They come to me for review and then a potential referral to our standards committee, where we then, evaluate fitness for the profession, as well as offer remediation or coaching if it's simply just a skill set or a deficit that learners might have had and they just need some more knowledge, awareness, or practice with something. Obviously we don't want to be too punitive, but we want to give you that coaching and ability to make sure you're successful when you return to your site or find a new site, depending on what's happened. So some of those are the circumstances that are obviously going to inform much of what I'm probably going to say with you guys tonight. I don't have a ton of slides, but I'll share my screen for a little while and then I'll stop sharing, or I may stop sharing periodically just because I have a hard time watching hands or the chat when I'm sharing my screen. So maybe Dr. Bayman can also clue me in if there's a big question and interrupt me. All right. You guys seeing my screen now?
Yes.
Perfect. So the first thing I guess I would just start with is just a reminder that when you're looking at ethics, always remember that law trumps ethics. So if you have a state rule or regulation that may be more restrictive or stringent than ethics, that rule or regulation would always supersede anything that would be in your ethical code. So one of the things that I recommend to learners is to review your state rules and regulations at least once every 6 months, because boards are constantly revising and looking at rules and creating new rules or updating or clarifying. So it doesn't always happen every 6 months, but if you're reading them every 6 months, you'll at least be knowledgeable and aware when changes happen and how those changes may impact you. Most boards will also send an email to all their licensed providers to notify them of changes. But while you're in internship, you're not licensed. So you're not likely to get that email saying, hey, the board's revised the rules regarding marriage and family therapy. Here's the new rules. So at least while you're a student, I highly recommend reading those and glancing at those about every 6 months, just to make sure nothing's changed in your particular state. And currently there is a lot of change happening legislatively with regards to mobility. And so once those kind of changes start happening and they begin looking at that, it just leads way to make other changes in rules. So while there may be no rules related to your education or internship that are directly being looked at right now, they could be considered if your state is one of those looking at mobility. Okay, and then just another reminder that our program adheres to the AAMFT Code of Ethics, and that was last revised in 2015, probably will be revised again sometime in the next 2 years. And there's a link to that. I'll send all these slides to Dr. Bayman and Dr. Schooley and Rashunda, I think is who I've been emailing with, so you guys can have the slides as well. So the two types of ethical challenges I think we face most often are client-driven challenges and site-driven challenges. So client-driven challenges are often around obtaining proper consent, confidentiality issues. Sometimes learners are faced with clients who may want to offer them gifts or other goods for their services. There's risk in terms of self-harm, suicidality, and just how to handle some of those challenges and who to inform. And then I think we see a lot of like dual relationship type issues that can arise that you may have to navigate, particularly learners who may live in a more rural or isolated area and have more interactions with some of their clients outside of the therapy setting than those who live in a more metropolitan area who may never see a client outside of a session. Site-driven ethical challenges often happen for our learners when there's advertising issues or how to recruit and market for clients, what the site and the learner are being called in terms of title, like is the site referring to you as just an intern or a student intern? Hopefully never referring to you as just a therapist. And then with role, if you happen to be doing your internship at your place of employment, there are sometimes sticky situations that can happen where you might be employed in one role at your agency, but you're also doing therapy there. And are you having any interactions with clients in both of those roles where it may be confusing for the client to know, what role are you holding right now? A lot of the times I kind of give the example of like a case manager and a therapist. If you're a case manager for somebody and you're sort of holding them accountable to achieving goals or standards or making benchmarks, and then as a therapist, you hold this level of unconditional positive regard, it can be confusing to maybe have you being a little more direct and like punctual. So we try to avoid those kind of things, but some sites struggle with, those boundaries or may put learners in roles that are a little bit more dually related. Sometimes too, when it comes to roles, we have learners being asked to do things that they really shouldn't be doing. And so those things come up as well. Billing practices have come up in terms of, are learners allowed to bill for this? Are learners allowed to, are sites allowed to? So those kind of things come up and we can talk more about those as well. And then with regards to policies and procedures, sometimes we've had a few sites that just had some unique practices or policies that don't necessarily align with the code of ethics or with things that you may have been taught. And so sometimes those are things that we can work through with the site. And sometimes, unfortunately, there's just some sites that really are not good sites for our learners. And it's not until a learner's placed there and we learn more about them that we realize like, oh no, this site's really not a healthy site for our learners. So sometimes those kind of policies and procedure pieces happen. So, I can talk a little bit more about these two types of ethical challenges, but I'll stop sharing my screen while I do that. And then I'll go on to some other slides. When you get into the client-driven ethical challenges around consent and confidentiality, some of the things I see most often are, if I'm recording at my site, how do I share my recording in a confidential manner so that there's nothing that could be seen by somebody who doesn't have consent to see that. So outside of your class, your faculty supervisor, and your site. So if you have recordings on your phone and your phone's not locked down or something like that, right? That presents levels of confidentiality. If your kids can get in there and play a session you've done, or a friend could do that. With consent, more often than not, I see things just around like, do I have to have consent from both parents in this type of situation, or do we have to do this? So those are the main consent ones, like usually around divorce and custody issues, or occasionally somebody may want to join a session with a learner. And, do you have proper consent for that? Or do you need consent depending on what the nature and circumstance is of somebody joining a session? I think gifts is a little more self-explanatory. And for some particular cultures, they like to share food, or it may be like a Christmas or a certain event, and a client may try to present you with a small gift. So there's those kind of things that happen. Risk is usually, like I have an adolescent who's suicidal or who's talking about getting drunk every night and having unprotected sex. Do I tell the parent? Do I not tell the parent? What do I do in some of these situations? And so those are the type of risk things I think I see most often. And then dual relationships, again, just for me, I guess I'll speak just personally. I have dual relationships come up a lot. Being in Wyoming, we're very small. And so it can be something like, I have a client who's made a session and I don't recognize the name, but when they walk into the session, I'm like, oh, we went to high school together, but they got married and their name changed and I didn't know it was somebody I knew, or I was really familiar with. Or I have children and I realized like, oh, you're my son's best friend's mom. And I didn't know that because you don't share the same last names or something along those lines. Or, oh, you're my hairdresser now because I showed up at JCPenney's and there's my client that's about to cut my hair. So those kind of things are like dual relationships that come up with regards to client driven. I talked a little bit about site driven. The one I didn't really expand on was advertising. The one that we see happen most often is if your site's asking you to help market yourself for clients, and whatever you're doing to market your services as a student, the site doesn't allow you to clearly identify yourself as a student intern. And so some sites, like psychotherapy, is it the Psychotherapy Network, or maybe that offers like a MFT therapist finder type tool. I think that they have the ability to select intern, but in many states, intern means you're associate licensed, not that you're a student without a license and in training. There are a few sites that we have discovered that will allow you to clearly identify yourself as a student intern. If not, I think that's something that can also be done in your description of your services or what you're allowed to do. But that's just a couple areas that we've seen where learners have had challenges. We've also had a few with regards to title and role where sites have wanted to do like business cards for a learner. And on the card, they just write therapist, not like student in training or therapist in training. So it's just always like clearly identifying yourself to that general public that you are still a student and you are not fully licensed, so that they understand, one, that you have somebody overseeing the work that you're doing, but two, the level of skill and education that you currently have as compared to. Billing practices, the main one I see is, am I allowed to take money for services, which we have a process for, but then sometimes there's also, my site wants to bill insurance and they want me to do X, Y, or Z. And in most instances, if the site is billing on behalf of you, they're probably doing it more ethically. But if they're wanting you to bill, that's when I would get real curious about and inquire more, because most insurance companies require you to be able to practice independently for you to bill. I think Medicaid is the primary exception in that they allow many different types of services to be billed under their insurance, not including therapy. So let me move to the next slide and share my screen. So when you're faced with a client-driven ethical challenge, one of the things I thought I guess would be important to cover is what should you do in those instances? So the first thing I always tell is like consult, consult, consult. So if you have a client situation you're not sure what you want to do with, consult with your site supervisor, consult with your faculty instructor, talk to peers at your agency, but share what's going on, seek that consultation, definitely inform your site supervisor. In most instances, things that happen with your clients at your site, the site and your site supervisor are the authority on that matter because they are the clients of that site. And technically, your site supervisor is the one who is signing off and being liable for the work that you're doing as a student intern within your within your state. So your faculty supervisor, we provide you with general supervision, guidance on MFT and systemic therapy. We will engage with you in ideas and suggestions, but ultimately, if your site wants you to handle something in a certain manner, unless it's just like so far out there that you're like, oh my God, they want me to do this and there's no way I should be doing that. We'll get to that on the next slide. The site would ultimately hold the authority in those situations. So I think that that's important to be mindful of. And then documentation. So whenever you have like a big ethical challenge, find whatever kind of decision-making model you want to engage in. And then as you're engaging in that, document like I wasn't sure what to do about my adolescent who said she was having unprotected sex and she has a lot of disabilities. Consulted with my supervisor on the need. Is this considered, like a form of self-harm? Is this something that we would disclose to parents? Does the law prevent me from doing so due to age of consent? But you document like what were the issues that were faced? Who did you consult with? Or what did you do to kind of find an answer? Like I called a resource or I talked with my supervisor, whatever. And then you want to document what action did you take as a result of that process that you took. So that way, when things come up or if anything ever gets questioned, you have it clearly documented, just like you would a crisis situation. Somebody presented as suicidal. I asked them if they were suicidal. We did the following steps to try to make a plan for safety. And here's next actions. So you're doing that same thing whenever you're faced with like a true ethical challenge or dilemma. You want to document what you've done to sort of circumvent or resolve that ethical dilemma. On the other hand, if you're having issues around ethics and it's driven from site concerns or site challenges, I think there's some different steps you want to take. You might want to first share your concerns with your faculty supervisor. Let them know what's going on at your site, what's not sitting well. It may just be there's a misunderstanding. It may be that something changed and you may not have been aware of it. So it may be a simple, just clarifying question. You may also want to express the concern with your site, sometimes taking a one down approach, right? Like, can you help me understand why I might do this? Or could you help me understand X, Y, or Z and see what explanation or rationale they give you? Sometimes it can be as simple as your site may be hosting learners from multiple different programs or multiple different disciplines. And what happened in one discipline can be different than what's allowed in another discipline. I'm going to feel bad because I can't think of the exact phrases, but when it comes to sex with clients, there's some unique differences in code of ethics amongst disciplines where some have like a time frame where you are allowed to engage in a relationship with a client after they've terminated, and other ethics state you are never allowed to do that. So that would be like one of those kind of defining things that it may be whatever you're seeing as a result of like a discipline specific type thing. If you still have concerns and you've talked with your site supervisor or you've talked with your faculty instructor and things just aren't improving or they're persisting or it's really serious, I recommend you request to have a meeting with your site and your faculty supervisor. If your faculty supervisor isn't willing to hold that meeting, you could reach out to program leadership but I'm not aware of a site supervisor, a faculty supervisor who would be unwilling to do that. But there may also be a faculty supervisor who is like, this is such a big issue. I'm also going to loop in program leadership to meet with us and your site, which can happen. And if the issues again persist or they're of a nature that it just really can't be resolved and the site is not a good fit, we would help you to terminate in an ethical manner. So you're not abandoning clients, but you're also not remaining at a site that's not safe or healthy or operating ethically. And then depending on, again, the circumstances that were happening, there may be a need to assist you in reporting to your state some of your concerns around the ethical issues or practices or whatever was happening that led to a termination or led to, further action needing to happen, because we all have that kind of duty as well to report to our state board when we see things happening that shouldn't be happening. So I think those are, kind of two very different approaches to the very basics of how you might handle an ethical concern without getting into any specifics. There's this track that you really want to work with your site on. And then there's another track where you really want to work through the program and your faculty supervisor with to kind of figure out the next best steps and where to go from there. And then the other thing I wanted to really kind of point out in this discussion too is don't forget, sometimes you have some great resources. So one of the resources I highlight a lot when it comes to ethics or legal issues is your malpractice insurance. If you don't know and you're not in internship yet, CPH and Associates is one of the insurance providers that works with AAMFT. And so as a student member of AAMFT, you are given a free malpractice insurance policy through CPH and Associates. However, if you're not a student member and you've purchased your own policy, you can also purchase directly with CPH and Associates. There are other providers that you can purchase with as well. I'm most familiar with CPH and Associates, which is why I'm highlighting them in this presentation. And I put the website, but they offer anybody who holds liability insurance with them like free legal consultation if you have challenges, and they publish this avoiding liability bulletin, which is a monthly bulletin, and it will showcase. So I'll click on it and show you guys. Is it following my screen? Thumbs up. Did it follow my screen? Thanks, Dr. B. So they have these avoiding liability bulletins. You can click on the mental health one and they will post articles every month. And Dr. Richard Leslie has his law degree, and this is what he specializes in, is mental health. And so he posts these kind of common challenges or tips and tricks around ethical things. So there's always information here that you can look for some guidance and general help as well. So just wanting to point out, like, in addition to your faculty, in addition to your ethics, in addition to your rules and regulations, all of you, when you're in internship, will also carry liability insurance. So if you pick a provider that offers some of these resources, I think that's really beneficial as well. And it's a tool in your toolbox that you can use at any time. But just to give you a heads up there. I don't think.
Dr. Heenan, we have a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to take it now. Angela Holder asks, how soon should I change my insurance from student to associate once I graduate?
I recommend doing so because it'll provide you different levels of coverage. And it's also representative of where you're at with your degree, right? So you want to hold insurances that cover you at the highest degree that you hold or the license that you hold. So if you do get into a bind and you have to call for assistance, you don't look as if you've misrepresented yourself in any manner with your insurance company. Because what I would assume the insurance company would think is you didn't up your policy. Susie, I see your question. That's an interesting one too. So when you're working with a couple, and she's asking if you're working with a couple and then one of the same individuals from the couple wants to be seen in individual therapy, how would you do that ethically? Or where do you find the line in that? How do you inform that? So I think that that's an interesting question because on some levels, when you're working with a couple, the couple is considered to be your client, correct? And so then if one of the spouses or partners would like to see you in individual therapy, my first question is, what is it that they want to work on in individual therapy? So if it relates back to the couple issue, a lot of times I don't think it's as difficult to manage that. If what they want to do in individual therapy is completely unique or different from what you're doing in couples therapy, I think that presents more challenges because more things can come up that would inform your work with the couple that you may not be able to take back to the couple relationship, which may put you in a situation where you may be secret keeping to an extent. And in that case, it may be easier to have them see somebody else for that individual therapy and sign some type of release or statement where you guys could consult periodically just to make sure that what's happening between the two therapies is not in contradiction in any way. So let me try to think of an example. Maybe I'm seeing a couple and they're having intimacy issues, and one partner is having a lot of body image issues and just not feeling comfortable expressing themselves sexually because of those body image issues, but is also having a hard time, opening up about that body image in front of their partner in the session. So maybe that's one example where maybe I'd want to see that partner individually a few times to kind of work on helping them where they felt like more comfortable to share their concerns with their partner or to address whatever was happening with their body image. But it relates very much back to what the couple's also working on, and it doesn't really kind of create a level of concern for me in that, what would I do in this situation? Whereas, if I was working with maybe a high conflict couple and they're on the brink of divorce periodically, and one partner's suddenly like, well, I want to see you individually. And they didn't really have like a clear plan as to why. They just felt like, well, I'm not getting anywhere in the couple, so I just want to see you individually. That one I may struggle more with because if I'm working with that person individually, right, I'm going to develop a different type of understanding of that person. I may be exposed to other thoughts or fears they have about their relationship that they haven't shared in the session. And so then when I come together and meet with them as a couple, I've got a level of information that I may not be able to share back to the couple. I suppose in some instance you could say I could see you individually, but please note that anything we talk about that would impact your couple relationship would go back to that, and I wouldn't keep secrets. I think that there's probably some therapists who could approach it that way, and as long as I think that's outlined in your consent for that individual therapy or spelled out before that starts. And I would probably do a separate consent for that in that instance, because you're really not treating like the couple in that case. You really are working with an individual and then a couple. And then, like I said, I think the other bet is like you can refer that individual to somebody else. You didn't ask this question, but I also see this one come up a lot. Like, what if I've been treating somebody individually for a while and then they want to come to me for couples therapy? That one I think is also tricky, right? Because you have a previously established relationship with that individual and a prior history and knowledge that their partner doesn't have with you. And so sometimes I think it can work, and sometimes I think it has to be a pretty open dialogue in terms of the partner's comfort level with you having that prior established relationship, and would they feel like maybe you were biased to their partner, or that you maybe had preconceived notions about who they were from what their partner shared with them. So I think you'd want to have a pretty open dialogue and conversation around those kind of pieces too, just going in the opposite direction.
That scenario I'm more comfortable with because oftentimes the partner asks for couples because individual is going well and they're like, all right, I want in on this. It's like, awesome, let's get the team in. But it's more the where there are like heavy traumas on one side or both of the partnership, or like heavier diagnoses like OCD, BPD, CPTSD, that is presenting in ways that's not always safe to present in couples. And then in a very rural place, it almost feels like it hurts the couple dynamic for the individual to not have more treatment. Like expecting the couple to answer for all of the anxieties in their life when some individual work can help soothe things in the couple, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Really
That's why I
high-level.
think I would probably err on the caution of, if you're going to treat them individually outside of the couple system, just acknowledging that impacts to them as a couple, which is the primary client, right, would still come back to, unless you're comfortable. There are a few therapists that are comfortable with secrets and it doesn't bother them. That's not something, but I don't really have a poker face either, and and things like that. So if I know something and I'm supposed to pretend like I don't, or I would be much more concerned about risking the confidentiality of something that happened in a couple session by accidentally sharing something that was related to the couple, or it would just not be a situation. I think it would create a lot of anxiety for me to be in that situation, if I'm just being honest. So I think that's where I would probably just talk more about, like, I'm happy to treat you individually to address these things, but there's things that come up that would really impact your relationship and you guys as the couple, the primary client, then I want
I
you to
like
know.
your perspective on that. Thank you, Dr. Heenan.
Yeah. So I see a question: can I discuss ethical behavior with respect to using Whitaker's model of experiential therapy? I may need to get some more explanation on that. That one is a little broad, and I'm guessing you're kind of referring to how Whitaker can be a little unorthodox at times or say things.
Yeah.
But
So my site supervisor had a discussion with me because that's my model that I'm using this quarter. And she was making a point that if Whitaker were doing what he did today, he probably wouldn't have his license anymore. And so she was just like, you kind of have to pick and choose carefully, and some of the things that are outlined in his model you can't really do, so you have to make adjustments. And I was just wondering if anything comes to mind when you think about that, like where those lines are.
well, I don't know if I would think that there's anything in Whitaker's approach that would be outlawed or banned that he did, but I think that there's probably more lens to social justice and, awareness and microaggressions and things like that, that if you're using an offhanded comment that he might have used, that may not be as socially acceptable in today's day and age, right? Like, I think there's probably just a certain level of respect so that you are not seen as being disrespectful in your challenges or some of the observations you may make about the system or the client in general. To me, I think, like, if I thought back to some of Whitaker's past sessions that I've seen in I could see where people could take offense to in today's day and age, because it would not be as acceptable, some of the things he said. But I think you can still have the same level of interaction and ability to kind of throw out that unexpected or share the observation as you see it. I think it's just a matter of doing it so in a respectful way. I don't know. Dr. Bateman or Dr. Schooley want to add to that, given their knowledge of either model?
Inland's better with the models, but in respect to this, I did a while back in the Spill the Tea on structure, on strategic, and people asked sort of the same question, Deanna, like if I paradox a client, isn't that like, is that unethical? And I think first of all, you have to know to do no harm. First of all, that has to be, as a therapist, you're not doing harm when you're offering an intervention like a paradox or something like that. You're doing it in a way to help your client, and you can document that you know that approach is to help the client. And in terms of like a paradox, they're already in a paradox, so you paradox them to get out of the paradox that they're in. So I think, again, going back to what Dr. Heenan had said, that I think you know, working through a decision-making model too, when you're doing something that might be seen as ethically challenging. Why are you doing it? Are you doing it to hurt your client? Are you doing it to help your client? Why are you doing that? Like, we wouldn't paradox a person who was suicidal by saying, why don't you think about killing yourself some more, right? I mean, even though that might be a good paradox in a sense, that probably is outside the lines of what's acceptable, you know. No. Well, and Dr. School, you probably, you know, this model and this approach better than I do.
Well, I mean, one of the things that Whitaker did is he always had a co-therapist. He did not work alone. And so that will help you to stay within boundaries and within ethical lines if you're always working with a co-therapist, particularly, preferably one who maybe has more experience than you. So I think Whitaker allowed himself to get outrageous because he had that other therapist to balance him. So I'd like you to keep that in mind. And even though Whitaker never really said this, when you look at what he does, it's very MRI-like, very, very much looking at patterns and disrupting patterns. And so, you know, when in doubt, you know, lean back over there to the MRI world to see what you're doing. Certainly that's where paradox comes from, and double bind and going hopeless and all of those kinds of things that are on a little on the outrageous side. But if you're alone as a therapist, I don't think you'd want to like fall asleep. Whitaker was famous for doing that. So, you know, you want to have a co-therapist for that. Those kinds of things. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. And Nicole, I see you asked a question on, you know, what's kind of a nice way to ethically address diversity issues, or to kind of maybe even inquire when something may be happening and you want to know the cultural relevance, or approach it from a culturally informed perspective without making assumptions.
Yeah,
Um,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I mean, that was pretty much it. I just know that, you know, it's so important that we come from a culturally informed perspective. And yeah, if we see something coming up that maybe we're not certain and we want to, you know, be curious and ask the client more, like I said, without making assumptions, just any guidance on that.
Well, one, I think it never hurts to sometimes acknowledge what we don't know as much about and say, no, I'd really like to better understand this part of who you are. Or could you tell me, do you feel like this aspect informs, in what way is it important to you? Or in what way do you think it informs your world view or your situation? So I think, you know, no matter who you're working with, some of those questions can be important, because you never know, right? Like, we can make assumptions from the minute we see somebody, but it's not until we ask and we start to glimmer more of their experience and their worldview that we know for sure like what's going on. So I think it's less about not making an assumption, because I think we all make assumptions constantly. It's not letting those assumptions interfere and really allowing the client to tell you and allowing the client to lead you. where they need to go. And really, I think also like listening, I'm a fairly firm believer that if something is informing the issue that brought the client to therapy, they're bound and determined to bring it up on some level. That they're going to clue you in that culture is an issue, or is a factor in their issue, based on what they're sharing with you or what they're telling you. But I think it's just important to ask them to what degree they feel like that informs, their worldview or what's impacting them, or, is that something that impacts them just even in general, so I think it's not maybe part of what I'm trying to say, and I'm not saying it very well. If I think back to like research questions in dissertations, I give the advice all the time, like don't ask the question where you're already presuming the answer. So if you're like, what cultural challenges might they have? And you're like, so are you having any cultural challenges? You're already assuming that there's challenges, right? Instead of saying, in what ways does this, or does this impact you, and allowing them to maybe surprise you by saying, no, it doesn't impact me at all. Or yes, here's how it impacts me. But when you say like, is this piece a part of, you're already assuming it is, I guess, in a certain way. So I think it's being sure you're asking very open-ended questions that allow the client to really give you the answer, and not a question that leads or presumes an answer.
Right. Thank you so much.
I see, have I worked with clients that had DID? I have not actually had any clients that have DID. Dr. Schooley has, apparently. Is there a follow-up question to that? That was a yes or no. Is there a follow-up on that one?
What specifically about DID were you asking about?
I don't know the learner. It's your pie chapter events. You're the one who asked.
Oh, that's Ty. Tylisha.
I was like, I'm not sure what your name is because it says.
Hey, Ty, what's your question about DID? Well, maybe she'll get back to me. Yeah.
Oh, she said, I'm currently working with a client with DID and was wondering what's the best approach to utilize.
Well, I don't know that there's a best for anything. I think that if you're interested in that, then go look up the literature on MFT models applied to dissociative identity disorder and see what pops up. But I certainly think that always the best model to use is the one you know how to do well. That's what I would always say. And so I approach everything, at least initially, from an MRI perspective, and then kind of see where things go. But then, when you've been doing it for 35 years, you've got a lot of models at your command. But you listen for what's going on there, and it also depends on what is their DID. May not be the problem. They may be perfectly happy having all these alters, and they're all conversing with each other. I've had clients that are like that we would sit down and I'd say, okay, so what would so and so say about this right now? And it would sound a lot like an internal family systems kind of a case, because I'd be calling on all these different alters that we had written out and figured out how old they were and done an internal genogram and all that kind of stuff. And the being in these pieces was not the problem. And this particular client went on one of those 100-mile bike events, and when she got back, she was integrated. Just happened while she was on the bike. She instead of talking about this, she was talking about I. But I would routinely, she'd ask a question, I'd say, well, what does so-and-so have to say about that? Or I would, instead of calling them the alters, I would call them her consultants, So what do the consultants say? Well, this one says that, and this one says that, and we would sort through all of that information. So it was, like I said, it was less about the DID. If someone is saying, I want to integrate, then we might talk about, rather than saying, okay, let's talk about killing them all off. Well, the alters might have something to say about that. They don't want to be killed off. And so instead, you might work harder at talking about how each of them plays an important role, and how do they call on those different parts of them. Because all of us have parts, and it doesn't have to be IFS type kind of parts. It can be, there's the part of me that's a daughter, and the part of me that's a partner, and a part of me that's an employer or an employee, or a hobbyist, or whatever. So we call on those different parts. So we acknowledge the strengths and challenges of each of those parts. And so they may not ever integrate, whatever the heck that means. But the fact that that all the different parts talk to each other, that's probably more important than anything else, is that everybody shares what everybody else's information is. And if they don't, then we get curious about what's going on with that. And that will feel a lot like IFS. What is it this part, IFS would call it the exile. What does this exile know about that the others don't know, but they're reacting to somehow? So.
Yeah, and I was just going to pop in and talk about the ethics of it. I guess because we're talking about legalities and ethics. Is there something about one of the parts that might be self-destructive? And do you have to document that there's a part or one of the identities of this person wants to harm the whole? And so that if you're working with that,
a lot of risky behaviors, right? Right. So yeah, so then you want to certainly assess anything that would require you to call in authorities of any kind. Yeah.
Remy,
thank you, Roxanne, for bringing me back to the topic at hand.
No, I cannot tell you how proud I am of you, Dr. Schooley. I loved your description of IFS. Remy, how about you? You have a question?
Yes. So I have a client that I'm working with, and I feel like she's trying to test the waters with me ethically, because my state has now introduced regulations about parental consent when working with individuals who are transgendered. And there have been some mentions of it, and I feel like she's trying to test the waters. And I'm not exactly sure how to best work with her, given the fact that she really doesn't want her parents involved in her therapy. And now they're introducing all this legislation about transgendered individuals. And I'm just like, what do I do?
Wow, great question. I think, well, first of all, knowing what the legislation is, because I'm not sure it's in effect. I don't know what state, Remy, that you're in, but I'm not sure if it's in effect. What I would do is be very clear up front. Here's the limits of confidentiality. And that's what I do with all clients, is saying, here's what I can keep private and here's what I can't keep confidential. And depending on this person's age of consent, that might, I don't know what state your age of consent is, but being very clear with your client that you're either under or over the age of consent, and there so being, I can keep your confidence or I can't keep your confidence. Dr. Schooley, anything?
Remy, you said consent. So if the client is under the age of 18, then there has to be parental consent for treatment anyway. So so I'm assuming you would have already gotten that, but consent does not mean you're going to break their confidentiality. And so I agree with Dr. Bayman. What exactly is the new law saying you have to share with the parents? Do you know offhand?
So the law, to my understanding, and I'm staffing this case with my supervisor Friday, but the law basically states that we're not allowed to provide gender affirming care without parental consent to do it. So basically, if she reveals that, then I have to tell the parent.
Well, I want to kind of wonder about what they mean by gender affirming care. That's different in a medical context than it is in a psychological context, right? I can use their, their gender. If they, I can talk to them. I can do therapy with them. That doesn't mean I'm changing their gender, so to speak. Like I'm not giving them hormones or I'm not doing any kind of, but I'm certainly going to be led by my clients. If my client comes in and that's what they want to talk about, I don't feel like I'm giving gender affirming care. I don't know. I would argue that I'm not changing anybody's gender, that they have their own gender identity.
I think that it probably would be different if I wasn't at the school seeing this client, but because I'm at the school, there's all of these little nuances, and it's just like, stop.
Well, I mean, just because you're at the school, you're not an employee of the school. You are
Yeah.
working under the agency. So the school does not have any right to dictate what you do or don't do. So they have no authority over you. You're just using their space, as far as that's concerned. I'm assuming your agency would take that particular tack. But I would agree with Dr. Bayman that you're exploring the challenges of them recognizing that they're transgender and the challenges of all of the various relationships they're in. That is not gender affirming. That's just exploring where they're at. And I would certainly think that at some point, one of the goals that the client has is being able to be at a place where they could share that with their parents, so that they can get support from that parent. But yeah, I don't think that law applies to what you are doing. But you would still, you would certainly use their preferred name, but then you would use, if a client went by, was name was James, but went by Jimmy, you would use Jimmy. So you would use whatever name they prefer. But I think it's a whatever state you're in, I would certainly not only talk to your supervisor, but I would talk to your AMFT organization to find out what they're saying about this and what are the kinds of things that they would be talking about. And Beth is asking what type of therapy. So gender affirming would be things like purchasing clothes for their appropriate, the gender that they prefer, providing hormones, doing things that do that. So North Carolina has a ban on gender affirming care under 18. But again, I would have to really, they would have to really explain how family therapy or even just talk therapy is gender affirming. I'm not sure how that would be. Just because you use they instead of he or she, that's not gender affirming. That's actually gender neutralizing. So
also, if they're born biologically male and they say I'm female and we say sure and we refer to them female, that's totally okay. I'm not changing their gender, right? I have no power to do that.
Yes, we're just using the client's language as preferred.
But I want to also say, if you're working in a state with these kinds of issues, like Dr. Heenan said in the beginning, you have access to an attorney for free because you all have your CPH liability insurance. We can't know every law in every state, but they do. They're specific attorneys for that state. And they specialize in mental health care. So I would say that might be a consult. Again, document that consult. Spoke with the attorney at CPH. They said da-da-da-da. And I would go by what they said. I know we're running out of time. I want to just hit Susie's question. Can you speak to how to discuss and get consent from parents for therapy and then maintain confidentially for their 17-year-old client? Now, in Colorado, it's 12. The age of consent is 12. So you got to know the age of consent in your state, right? So if a parent came to me, yeah, they gave consent, my child can be in therapy, I would explain to them, well, they're 14. I absolutely can reveal to you if there's harm to self or others, or if there's child abuse or neglect. I am mandated by law to disclose that. Anything else, I'm not mandated by law, but I certainly understand, parents, that you want to know what's going on, and I'm going to encourage your 17-year-old, your child, to bring you on in. If they're under the age of consent, bring the parents in with the child. The parents give you a double bind all the time. I want you to do therapy and make my child better, but I want to know everything. So I ask them outright with the parents in the room, parents, sex, drugs, rock and roll. What is it that you want to know about your kids? What are they allowed to tell me privately? What are you? Oh no, I want you to tell me everything about sex, drugs, rock and roll. So I turn to the child and I say, don't tell me anything about sex, drugs, and rock and roll unless you want your parents to know. I am not going to get stuck in that triangle. That's their anxiety. I'm putting it back in the system it belongs. Because then the parents they find that they're binding, then don't tell me anything you don't want your parents to know. Is that okay? Is that okay? You're sure? Okay, everybody knows. Well, we want you to work on our child though. Yeah, I don't know how to do that.
Yeah. And when the young person doesn't want the parent in the room, that's okay. You say, look, I have to have them in the room. They're paying the fee, or they have to. So you don't have to say anything. I'll talk to your parents about what they're worried about. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. What about that are they worried about? Michelle, you can submit it to Dr. Bayman this time.
Yes. Oh, before y'all leave, just
yeah.
know you can have 1 hour of AAMFT faculty supervision. Send it to me, and I'll approve it. Yeah, so we're after the time.
Yeah, please please look and see. There's the YouTube link. There's the link to the survey, the satisfaction survey about this workshop. Please look at that. And please note that the next event is May the 22nd. And I'm assuming if it's Dr. Pace, it's going to be on diversity. That's just my assumption on him. Maybe not, but that's probably what I think it is.
So I just want
okay.
I just want to refer to Michelle. I'm a therapist, right? And if a person comes into me and wants to talk about their issues, and I'm going to talk about their issues, if they want to feel comfortable in their bodies, I'm gonna talk to them about that. And if I'm going to use their preferred pronouns. If I get sued, I feel like, I'm not telling you guys to do anything your site supervisors tell you not to do. That's their license on top of you. My license it would be a hill I would die on. So, and I think I could back that up in my, if I was grieved.
And I think that at some point, some therapist is probably going to have to go to court to challenge the illegalities of those laws. And many of those laws don't go into effect because ACLU and organizations challenge them before they go into effect.